There is a specific kind of cold that seeps into your bones when the person you have slept next to for 35 years suddenly feels like a stranger plotting your ruin. It does not happen overnight. It creeps in like a slow-moving frost on a window pane until you wake up one morning and realize you cannot see the sunlight anymore. I am 68 years old. For 40 years of my life, I worked as a commercial architect. I built corporate offices, grand civic libraries, and high-rise apartments that touched the skyline. But my true masterpiece was my home. I bought 5 acres of raw, untamed land when I was just a young man starting out in the world. Over the decades, I poured every ounce of my sweat, my artistic vision, and my hard-earned savings into that soil. I designed every single room. I laid the heavy oak hardwood floors with my own 2 hands, measuring and cutting until my fingers bled. I planted the rows of maple and oak trees that now stand tall and proud, lining the long, winding driveway. This estate was never just a house to me. It was my legacy. It was the physical manifestation of my entire life's work, a peaceful sanctuary meant to shelter my wife, Beatrice, and me safely through our golden years. For 35 years, Beatrice and I had what I considered a strong, traditional marriage. At least, that is the lie I told myself to keep the peace. We had our disagreements, our struggles, and our quiet periods. Just like any couple who has weathered the decades together. I always believed we were a unified team. We built a comfortable, beautiful life together. But about 6 months ago, the atmosphere in our home began to shift radically. It started with small things, the kind of subtle behavioral changes you easily brush off if you are not paying close attention. Beatrice simply stopped asking about my day. Her warm, familiar smiles were completely replaced by a tight, practiced, and impatient line across her mouth. The quiet evenings we used to spend reading together in the warm glow of the study turned into her retiring to the bedroom early, closing the heavy wooden door with a quiet but incredibly firm click. She was shutting me out of her life. Room by room, then came the hushed, secretive phone calls. I would walk into the kitchen in the early morning to pour a cup of black coffee, and she would suddenly lower her voice to an urgent whisper. If I walked closer, she would hang up the receiver entirely, her face flushing with an unnatural, defensive guilt. When I asked who was on the line so early in the day, she would wave her hand dismissively, claiming it was just an annoying telemarketer or a persistent wrong number. But telemarketers do not make a grown woman constantly look over her shoulder. Wrong numbers do not make a wife lock her personal cell phone with a brand new passcode. A passcode she adamantly refused to share with her husband of 3.5 decades. She also began taking frequent, unexplained trips into the city. She told me she had started volunteering at a local community charity, organizing food drives and clothing donations. But the mileage tracker on her car dashboard told a completely different story. She was driving far more miles than a simple trip to the local community center would ever require. She would return late in the evening with a strange, frantic, and nervous energy that I could not quite place. She would immediately head to her vanity, unlocking a small bottom drawer she had recently installed a brass padlock on, slipping folded papers inside before quickly hiding the key. I did not know it then, but those secret trips and those hidden papers were the very foundation of an elaborate trap designed to completely strip me of everything I owned. At first, I stubbornly blamed her behavior on the stress of getting older. I thought perhaps she was struggling with the harsh reality of our twilight years, feeling the heavy weight of mortality. I tried desperately to be more attentive, hoping to bridge the widening gap between us. I bought her favorite yellow roses and left them on the kitchen island. I suggested we take a long, relaxing vacation to the coast to clear our heads. I even offered to hire full-time help to take over the household chores so she could simply rest. I made endless excuses for her biting coldness. I told myself that love simply changes its shape as you age, that the roaring fire of youth naturally cools into a quiet, distant companionship. I was willingly blinding myself to the ugly truth because the alternative was far too painful for a man of my age to accept. I refused to see the predator sitting quietly across from me at the breakfast table, sipping tea while calculating my downfall. My desperate denial became entirely impossible to maintain when her younger sister, Clara, started making regular, uninvited appearances at the estate. Clara and I never saw eye to eye, not even on my wedding day. She was a bitter, deeply envious, and materialistic woman who had spent her entire adult life jumping from one catastrophic financial scheme to another. She burned through 3 wealthy husbands and squandered every settlement she ever received. Clara always looked at my home, my sanctuary, with a vile mixture of pure greed and deep resentment. She looked at my hand-carved mahogany banisters and my custom stone fireplace, as if she firmly believed she deserved to own them simply by right of existence. Historically, Beatrice kept Clara at a safe distance, knowing exactly how much her sister's toxic presence irritated me. But suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped, Clara was everywhere. I would walk outside to tend to the garden and find Clara wandering the grounds, aggressively examining the landscaping and taking measurements of the patio. I would come inside to find her wandering through the guest bedrooms, running her manicured hands over the custom woodwork I had meticulously designed. Most concerning of all, she carried a small, worn leather notebook with her at all times. I watched from my second-story study window one Tuesday afternoon as she confidently walked the entire perimeter of the property. She was jotting down frantic notes and taking detailed photographs of the structural foundations, the roof line, and the exact property lines. When I went downstairs and confronted Beatrice about this bizarre invasion of privacy, she brushed me off with a loud, forced laugh that lacked any real warmth. She claimed Clara was simply interested in taking up gardening and wanted some inspiration from our award-winning yard. It was a pathetic, transparent lie, and we both knew it the second the words left her mouth. But the real turning point, the exact moment the icy dread truly settled deep into my stomach and shattered my illusions forever, happened 3 days later. I was walking softly down the upstairs hallway, returning from a late-night glass of water. As I passed the dimly lit guest bedroom, I saw Clara standing by the bed. She was hurriedly slipping a thick, heavy manila envelope into her oversized designer handbag. The look of sheer, venomous triumph on her face when she zipped that bag shut is a haunting image that will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. She looked like a thief who had just pulled off the heist of the century. I knew right then, standing in the dark hallway of the home I built with my own hands, that I was not just losing my wife to the natural, emotional drift of old age. I was being actively hunted by the 2 women I had foolishly allowed inside my fortress. The war had already begun, and I was entirely unarmed. A locked door in your own home is an unbearable insult, but a sudden password on a family computer you have shared for a decade is a glaring red alarm of impending destruction. I had to know exactly what venom was brewing behind that glowing screen. It was a crisp Tuesday morning when Beatrice announced she was spending the entire day in the city, attending a lengthy charity luncheon followed by a spa trip with her sister, Clara. She kissed me on the cheek, a dry, rehearsed peck that felt more like a Judas kiss than an act of affection, and drove her sedan down the long driveway. The moment her car disappeared beyond the oak trees, I walked straight into the den. The house was completely silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, a clock I had hand-wound every single week for 35 years. I sat down at the heavy mahogany desk and woke up the computer monitor. There it was, a harsh, demanding password prompt where there used to be direct access. Beatrice was not a tech-savvy woman. She did not understand the complexities of digital security. I knew her password would be something arrogant, something emotionally significant to her current state of mind. I tried her birth year, incorrect. I tried our anniversary date, incorrect, and frankly, I should have known better than to think she would use a date she clearly despised. I sat back and thought about the sudden, intense bond she had rekindled with her sister. I typed in Clara's middle name followed by the year Beatrice was born. The screen flashed, and the desktop appeared. I did not realize then that a single, unassuming digital folder sitting quietly on the desktop would be the very weapon I would eventually use to sever the rotting limbs of my family tree. The folder was simply titled Tax Documents. It was a clever enough disguise for a passing glance. But I was not glancing. I was searching for my life. I double-clicked the icon, opening a sprawling archive of downloaded emails, scanned documents, and saved text message logs. Beatrice had meticulously documented her own treason, likely at Clara's insistence to keep their timeline organized. I opened the very first document, an email thread dated nearly 8 months ago. The subject line read, "The Asset." I felt a sharp, icy prickle at the base of my neck. I began to read, "He is getting more tired these days," Beatrice had written to her sister. "He barely looks at the household finances anymore. I think it will be incredibly easy to convince him we need to protect the house from future medical debt. You know how paranoid he is about ending up in a poorly run nursing home." Clara's reply was waiting right below it, dripping with her signature greed. "Just get the old fool to sign the transfer. I have my savings ready. I will wire you the $50,000 to make it look like a perfectly legal, fair market transaction on paper. Once the deed is officially in my name, we serve him the eviction notice. You file for the divorce immediately, and we list the estate on the open market for at least $5 million. We split the profits, and we never have to look back." I sat in the heavy leather chair, the leather creaking under my weight, and stared at the glowing monitor. My hands were shaking, not from age or infirmity, but from the sheer, unadulterated shock of what I was reading. This was not a passing fantasy or a venting session between angry siblings. This was a highly detailed, legally calculated long con. They were planning an elaborate ruse masked as estate tax planning. Beatrice was going to convince me that the only way to protect our sprawling, multi-million-dollar property from hypothetical government taxes or future medical seizures was to temporarily transfer the ownership out of my name. They were going to bring in a lawyer, bury the deed transfer in a mountain of dense, confusing paperwork, and rely entirely on my fading eyesight and my unwavering trust in my wife. Once Clara held the deed, she would kick me out onto the street. Beatrice would divorce me, taking half of whatever liquid assets we had left, and then they would sell my sanctuary, my life's work, to the highest bidder. I read through dozens of messages. They discussed exactly how they would spend the money. Clara wanted a luxury condo in a high-end retirement community down south. Beatrice was eyeing extensive plastic surgery and a year-long cruise around the world. They referred to me not as a husband, not as a brother-in-law, and not even as a human being. In their twisted, greedy correspondence, I was simply referred to as the obstacle or the dead weight, the sheer emotional blow of a 35-year marriage turning out to be a financial long con hit me like a physical strike to the chest. The room began to spin. I closed my eyes, and a devastating montage of my life with Beatrice played behind my eyelids. I thought of the night I proposed to her under the gazebo I had built with my own hands. I thought of the agonizing weeks I spent sleeping in a terrible hospital chair when she had severe pneumonia 10 years ago, refusing to leave her side for even an hour. I thought of every shared meal, every quiet Sunday morning, every Christmas morning by the stone fireplace. It was all ashes. Every kiss she had given me over the last 8 months was a calculated move to keep me docile. Every warm dinner she cooked was bait in a trap. I realized, with a profound and crushing grief, that the woman I loved was entirely gone. Perhaps she had never truly existed at all. Perhaps she had always been a hollow vessel waiting for the right moment to crack open and reveal the rot inside. I sat in that silent room for 2 hours. I allowed myself to feel the agony. I let the tears fall, hot and bitter, soaking the collar of my shirt. I mourned the death of my marriage. I mourned the loss of the future I thought I had secured. But then, something inside me shifted. The grief, having washed over me like a violent storm, suddenly evaporated. It did not leave behind sadness. It left behind a cold, diamond-hard resolve. I am an architect. My entire professional life was dedicated to understanding structural integrity, stress points, and foundations. When a massive wooden beam is discovered to be rotten and infested with termites, a good architect does not sit on the floor and weep over the compromised wood. He calculates exactly how to cleanly remove the rotting beam so it does not bring down the entire house, and then he replaces it with solid steel. Beatrice and Clara were the rot, and I was going to cut them out of my life with surgical precision. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my cellular phone, and meticulously took clear, high-resolution photographs of every single email, every single financial plot, and every vile message they had exchanged. I captured the timestamps, the email addresses, and the specific legal jargon Clara had clearly been fed by whatever shady attorney she had waiting in the wings. I made sure I had a complete, undeniable digital copy of their entire conspiracy. When I finished, I closed the folder, cleared the recent viewing history just as I had learned to do years ago, and locked the computer screen. I stood up, rolled my shoulders back, and took a deep, steadying breath. The air in my home suddenly felt different. It was no longer a place of confusion and subtle hostility. It was a battlefield, and I finally knew exactly where the enemy lines were drawn. They thought I was just an exhausted, trusting old man ready to be led quietly out to the slaughterhouse, completely unaware of the massive, impenetrable fortress I had already built around my assets years before this betrayal even crossed their greedy minds. I walked into the kitchen, poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, and smiled. It was a terrifying, humorless smile. If Beatrice wanted to play a game of deception, I would give her the performance of a lifetime. I would be the tired, compliant, confused husband she so desperately needed me to be. I would let them build their beautiful house of cards as high as they possibly could, and I would wait patiently for the absolute perfect moment to blow it all down. The most dangerous part of any trap is the bait, and my wife was suddenly serving it up on a silver platter with a sickeningly sweet smile. The shift in Beatrice was immediate and nauseating. Just 4 days after I discovered the horrific truth on her computer, the cold, distant woman I had been living with vanished. In her place returned the doting, affectionate wife I thought I had lost. It started with breakfast. I came downstairs at 7 in the morning to the smell of frying bacon and fresh pancakes, my absolute favorite meal. Beatrice was standing at the stove, humming a cheerful tune, wearing a floral apron I had not seen in 5 years. She poured my coffee, kissed my cheek lingeringly, and asked how I had slept. If I had not seen those emails, my heart would have soared. I would have believed my prayers were answered, that the strange, icy phase of our marriage was finally over. Instead, a cold knot of pure disgust tightened in my stomach. I smiled back at her, a weak, trembling smile that I forced onto my face, and thanked her for the meal. The performance had officially begun. I leaned heavily on the kitchen counter, letting my shoulders slump just a fraction more than usual. Complaining about a phantom ache in my lower back, I needed her to see a fading, fragile old man, and she eagerly drank it in. For 2 straight weeks, she layered on the affection. She suggested we watch my favorite old Western films in the evening. She rubbed my shoulders when I sat in my reading chair. She even started leaving little affectionate notes on the bathroom mirror. It took every ounce of my willpower not to tear those notes to shreds and scream the truth into her deceitful face. But I knew that a master builder never rushes the foundation. I played my part perfectly. I acted slightly forgetful. I asked her the same questions twice in 1 hour. I let my hands shake slightly when I reached for my water glass. I was giving her the exact confirmation she desperately needed to move to the next phase of her despicable plan. The pivot happened on a rainy Thursday evening. We were sitting by the fire when Beatrice sighed heavily, placing her hand over mine. She looked at me with wide, terribly fake eyes filled with manufactured worry. She told me she had been reading terrifying articles about the government seizing the homes of the elderly to pay for unforeseen medical debts. She spun a tragic, entirely fictional tale about a friend of a friend who lost their family estate because they did not protect their assets in time. She squeezed my hand tightly, pleading that she could not bear the thought of us losing the home I had built if one of us fell ill. I let a look of deep, terrified concern wash over my face. I asked her what we could possibly do. Right on cue, she suggested we speak to a specialist, an estate planner she had conveniently heard about through her sister. I agreed instantly, nodding like a frightened child seeking reassurance. 2 days later, the snake slithered through my front door. His name was Mr. Vance, a slick, fast-talking attorney with an overly tailored suit and a smile that did not quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. He carried a thick leather briefcase that looked heavy enough to hold a lifetime of lies. Beatrice played the gracious hostess, pouring him expensive scotch while he spread a mountain of dense, legally convoluted documents across my beautiful dining room table. Vance began his pitch, speaking quickly, using aggressive legal jargon designed to confuse and overwhelm a layman. He explained that to truly protect the property from medical liens, we needed to execute a temporary, perfectly legal transfer of the deed to a trusted third party, a family member, he suggested smoothly. Someone like Beatrice's sister, Clara. He assured me it was merely a paper transaction, a protective shield, and that I would retain absolute right of residency until the day I died. I sat there, staring blankly at the stacks of paper. I knew every single clause of real estate law by heart after 40 years in the commercial building industry. But I let them believe my mind was slipping. A fatal miscalculation they would soon pay for dearly. I squinted at the pages, asking Vance to repeat himself several times. I rubbed my temples, acting as though the legal terms were giving me a severe migraine. "So," I said, my voice intentionally wavering, "if I sign this, the house goes to Clara, but we still live here? Are you absolutely sure the government cannot take it?" Vance smiled his greasy smile, assuring me it was an ironclad strategy used by the wealthiest families in the country. Beatrice chimed in, her voice dripping with fake devotion, telling me it was the only way she could sleep soundly at night, knowing our future was secure. I picked up the heavy brass pen Vance offered me, letting it hover over the signature line. Then, I put it down. I saw a microsecond of sheer panic flash across Beatrice's face. "I am just worried," I said slowly, looking between my wife and her fraudulent lawyer. "If this is a paper transaction, won't the government auditors see right through it? If Clara does not actually pay for the house, it looks like a fraudulent transfer to hide assets. I read about that in the newspaper. They call it a clawback provision. If they see a $0 transfer, they will seize the house anyway and throw us in federal prison for tax evasion." The room went dead silent. Vance blinked, clearly not expecting the tired old man to bring up federal auditing procedures. Beatrice swallowed hard. "Well," Vance stammered, pulling at his expensive silk tie, "there is usually a nominal fee attached to make it legitimate. $1,000. Perhaps—" I shook my head vigorously, leaning forward with the stubborn paranoia of an elderly man terrified of the government. No, that is not enough. $1,000 for a multi-million-dollar estate? An auditor would laugh in our faces. The sale has to look completely real. Clara has to transfer a massive, undeniable sum of money into our joint account, a life savings amount, something that proves this was a legitimate, undisputed sale. Otherwise, I simply cannot risk going to jail at my age. I will not sign it." Beatrice stared at me, her jaw slightly slack. I was hijacking their scam, wrapping it in my own fake paranoia, and steering it exactly where I needed it to go. They wanted to steal my house. I was making sure they drained every single drop of their own blood to do it. Vance looked at Beatrice, unsure of how to proceed. Beatrice, blinded by the proximity of her prize, quickly calculated the risk. She knew Clara had a sizable nest egg from her last divorce settlement, roughly $250,000. "Arthur is right," Beatrice said quickly, playing the supportive wife. "We have to be smart. Clara can wire $250,000 as a down payment. We hold it in the joint account, the house goes into her name, and we are entirely safe from the medical auditors." They thought they were draining my life savings, completely unaware that the very account Clara was wiring her money into was about to become an inescapable black hole. I nodded slowly, letting out a long, dramatic sigh of relief. Yes, that sounds much safer. A real transaction. $250,000 wired directly to us before I sign anything. That way, the government cannot touch us. Vance hurriedly wrote down the new stipulations, his hands shaking slightly with the thrill of the grift. They thought they were brilliant. They thought they were manipulating a terrified, senile architect into giving away his empire. They had absolutely no idea that the very transaction they were eagerly drafting was pulling them deeper into the abyss. I smiled at Beatrice, patting her hand gently. She smiled back, a genuine smile this time, fueled by pure, unadulterated greed. We agreed to finalize the paperwork at the end of the week, giving Clara exactly 4 days to liquidate her entire life savings and prepare the massive wire transfer. When Vance finally packed his leather briefcase and scurried out into the rainy night, Beatrice hugged me tightly in the foyer. She whispered that she loved me and that I was doing the right thing for our family. I held her in my arms, resting my chin on her shoulder so she could not see the expression on my face. I am doing exactly what needs to be done, I whispered back to her. She went up to bed, practically skipping up the mahogany stairs. I walked back into the dining room, looking at the empty scotch glass Vance had left behind. The board was set, the bait was taken. Now, all I had to do was let them lock themselves inside the cage. There is a unique kind of silence that fills a room when thieves believe they have finally gotten away with the ultimate crime. It is a thick, suffocating silence that smells faintly of cheap victory and impending doom. Friday afternoon arrived with a heavy, gray, overcast sky that perfectly matched the atmosphere inside my home. I sat at the head of the long oak dining table, the very table I had carved and sanded by hand 3 decades ago. The polished wood felt cool beneath my fingertips. Across from me sat Vance, the slippery lawyer, organizing his thick stacks of fraudulent documents with practiced, eager hands. To his left sat my wife, Beatrice, vibrating with a nervous, electric energy she was desperately trying to disguise as spousal concern. And to her left sat her sister, Clara. Clara was practically glowing. She wore a gaudy silk blouse that was far too bright for the gloomy weather, and a smug, victorious smile that she could barely keep contained. She looked at my dining room walls, my custom built-in bookshelves, and my antique grandfather clock with the ravenous eyes of a vulture that had finally found its meal. Before we began, I leaned heavily on my cane, a prop I had started carrying around the house entirely for their benefit, and cleared my throat. I looked directly at Vance, letting my voice shake just enough to sound like a terrified, confused old man clinging to his last shred of security. I asked him for the physical proof of the wire transfer before I put my name on a single line. I demanded to see the guarantee that the government would not throw me in federal prison for a $0 property transfer. Vance offered his oily smile and slid a crisp bank confirmation receipt across the polished oak. I picked it up with trembling hands and adjusted my reading glasses. There it was, printed in stark black ink. $250,000. Clara's entire life savings. Every last dime she had squeezed out of her previous divorces. Officially transferred. But as I scanned the routing and account numbers, I noticed a crucial, telling detail. The money had not been wired into the joint marital savings account we had agreed upon earlier in the week. The numbers belonged to Beatrice's private, individual account, the one she thought I knew absolutely nothing about. I looked up, letting my brow furrow in manufactured confusion. I pointed a trembling finger at the paper and asked Beatrice why the money was not in our shared account. Beatrice did not even flinch. She placed a warm, entirely deceptive hand over mine and spun a beautiful, seamless lie. She told me her personal banker advised her that a sudden, massive deposit into a joint account of an elderly couple might trigger an automatic audit from the medical review board we were supposedly hiding from. She claimed it was far safer in her private account, just for a few months. Until the imaginary threat had passed, I stared into the eyes of the woman I had loved for 35 years. She was looking back at me without a single ounce of remorse, actively locking away $250,000 so she could easily abandon me and flee the moment the ink was dry. She thought she was securing her own grand, luxurious getaway fund. But she had absolutely no idea how tightly that money was about to be locked away by her own unquenchable greed. I let out a long, weary sigh, nodding my head in slow submission. I told her that she was always the smart one with the finances, and that I trusted her completely. The relief that washed over her face was physically revolting to witness. Vance slid the first stack of papers toward me. The deed transfer, the relinquishment of property rights, the ironclad agreement that handed the keys to my kingdom directly to Clara. He handed me a heavy brass pen. This was the moment. This was the exact second they had been waiting and plotting for over the last 8 months. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the steady patter of rain against the large bay windows. I held the pen in my hand. I let it hover over the thick black signature line. I wanted them to sweat. I wanted to drag out their anticipation until it was almost painful. I looked at Clara. Her eyes were locked onto the tip of the pen like a starving animal watching a piece of meat. Her breathing was shallow. She was entirely consumed by the blinding fantasy of ownership. Then I looked at Beatrice. I gave her one final, silent test. I asked her, my voice dropping the fragile old man routine for just a fraction of a second, if she was absolutely sure this was the path she wanted us to take. I asked her if there was any other way. I offered her a single, fleeting chance to stop the madness, confess her sins, and save herself from the absolute devastation I had prepared. She smiled her sweet, poisonous smile, kissed my cheek, and told me to sign the papers so we could finally be safe. She failed the test. My conscience was officially, permanently clear. I lowered the pen and signed my name, Arthur Thomas Pendleton. I signed the first page, the second page, and the third. I initialed the margins just as Vance instructed. I signed away the land, the house, the oak trees, and the custom mahogany floors. I signed away 35 years of shared history with every stroke of the pen. Clara's smile grew wider, and Beatrice's shoulders relaxed further. They thought they were watching a tired, defeated old man hand over his multi-million-dollar empire for absolutely nothing. They thought they were witnessing the greatest financial victory of their miserable, greedy lives. What they did not know, what they could not possibly comprehend as they watched me sign those documents, was that my signature meant absolutely nothing. 5 years ago, long before Beatrice's heart turned cold, I experienced a minor health scare. It was a brief flutter in my chest that landed me in the hospital for 2 days of observation. It turned out to be nothing serious, just an excess of caffeine and stress. But lying in that sterile white hospital bed made me acutely aware of my own mortality. I realized that if I were to pass away suddenly, the probate courts could tie up my estate for years, draining its value and causing unnecessary headaches. So, being a meticulous architect who always plans for the worst structural failures, I quietly hired a highly specialized estate attorney in the city. Without telling Beatrice, because I wanted to surprise her with the finalized security later, I executed a massive, legally impenetrable maneuver. I placed the entire estate, the 5 acres of land, the house, and every single fixture attached to it, into an ironclad, irrevocable trust. I named myself the sole trustee and the sole beneficiary during my lifetime. In the rigid, unforgiving eyes of state and federal law, Arthur Thomas Pendleton, the individual man sitting at the dining room table, did not own a single blade of grass on this property. The trust owned it. And because the trust was irrevocable, its assets could not be sold, transferred, or manipulated by any individual without a grueling, complex legal dissolution that I entirely controlled. Therefore, the dense, threatening documents Vance had just forced me to sign were legally impossible to execute. I cannot sell a house I do not legally own. I was effectively selling Clara a magnificent, detailed drawing of a house, and she was paying $250,000 real dollars for the privilege of holding the paper. I finished the final signature and laid the brass pen down on the table with a soft, definitive click. Vance quickly gathered the papers, tapping them against the wood to align the edges, treating them like holy texts. He stamped them with his notary seal, entirely oblivious to the fact that he was notarizing an absolute fraud. He shook my hand, packed his briefcase, and practically sprinted out the front door to file the worthless paperwork at the county clerk's office. Clara could no longer contain herself. She leaped out of her chair and hugged Beatrice tightly, both of them letting out high-pitched, triumphant squeals. They were uncorking an imaginary bottle of champagne in the middle of my dining room, completely blind to the fact that the countdown timer on their entire comfortable existence had just reached 0. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on my cane once more. I told them I was feeling incredibly exhausted from the stress of the legal proceedings and needed to take a long afternoon nap. Beatrice waved me away dismissively, her attention already completely fixated on Clara and the false deed sitting on the table. I turned my back on them and walked slowly up the stairs. The moment I was out of their sight, I stood up straight. I lifted the cane off the ground and carried it under my arm. I walked into my study, closed the heavy door, and looked out the window at the sweeping, manicured lawns of my estate. They thought they had won. Clara had just emptied her entire life savings into a black hole. Beatrice had just committed textbook wire fraud and conspired to steal assets, effectively torching our marriage and her right to any future alimony. They had willingly locked themselves inside a burning building, and I was holding the only key to the exit. Let them celebrate. Let them measure the curtains and dream of luxury cruises. The higher they built their delusions of grandeur, the harder the concrete would feel when I finally ripped the floor out from under them. A mask worn too long begins to suffocate the wearer, and my wife could not wait to rip hers off the very moment she felt safe. She was so eager to deliver her final, crushing blow that she never bothered to check if her weapon was actually loaded. It took exactly 48 hours for the illusion of our renewed marriage to shatter completely into jagged, unrecognizable pieces. 2 days was the absolute maximum amount of time Beatrice could stomach pretending she still cared for the man she had just robbed. It was a Sunday afternoon, crisp and cool, the kind of day we used to spend reading the weekend papers on the back patio. Instead, I had taken a long, solitary walk around the sprawling perimeter of my estate. I touched the rough bark of the oak trees I had planted decades ago, tracing the deep grooves with my fingertips, fortifying my spirit for the storm I knew was rapidly approaching my front porch. As I rounded the final bend of the long, winding driveway, the peaceful silence of my sanctuary was violently shattered. A massive, brightly colored commercial moving truck was idling loudly right in front of my custom oak double doors. The heavy diesel engine rumbled, shaking the delicate stained glass of the entryway windows. A thick metal ramp was fully extended, resting heavily on the pristine cobblestone steps. My heart did not race. I did not feel a sudden spike of panic or a rush of adrenaline. I felt a profound, freezing calm wash over my entire body. The final act of her disgusting play had officially begun. I walked through the front doors and stepped into absolute chaos. 2 massive, sweaty men in matching company uniforms were aggressively hauling our antique hallway credenza out the door, entirely ignoring the deep gouge they were leaving on the mahogany floorboards. And standing in the center of the grand foyer, barking sharp, impatient orders, was Beatrice. The loving, doting wife in the floral apron was completely gone. In her place stood a cold, calculating stranger dressed head to toe in brand new, aggressively expensive designer clothing. She wore a sharp, cream-colored pantsuit, a heavy gold necklace that caught the afternoon light, and an arrogant posture that radiated pure, unadulterated venom. These were undoubtedly the very first purchases she had made with the massive sum of money Clara had wired directly into her private, hidden account. She was practically vibrating with the thrilling, intoxicating rush of a successful heist. She turned sharply when she heard the heavy oak door close behind me. For a brief, agonizing second, our eyes locked across the grand foyer. There was no hesitation in her gaze. There was no lingering guilt, no sadness over the death of our 35-year marriage, and absolutely no shame. There was only a twisted, victorious sneer stretching across her painted lips. She did not wait for me to speak. She did not offer a gentle transition or a soft landing for the devastating news she was about to deliver. She simply crossed her arms, tilted her chin up defiantly, and dropped the heavy axe right onto my neck. "I am leaving you, Arthur," she announced loudly, her voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the home I had built for her. "The movers are taking my personal belongings, my furniture from the sitting room, and my artwork. I am moving into a luxury high-rise downtown with Clara." I stood frozen by the front door, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, letting my shoulders drop in a carefully calculated display of utter, devastating shock. I let my mouth hang slightly open, staring at her as if she had just spoken to me in a foreign language. I needed to give her the grand, theatrical reaction she had been dreaming of for the last 8 months. "Beatrice," I whispered, forcing a fragile, pathetic waver into my voice. "What are you talking about? Where are you going? We just fixed everything. We secured our future." "We protected the house." She let out a harsh, barking laugh that chilled me down to the marrow of my bones. It was the sound of a predator playing with its cornered food. "You ridiculous, foolish old man," she spat, her voice dripping with absolute contempt. "Did you really think I wanted to spend the rest of my vibrant life trapped in this dusty museum, watching you slowly deteriorate? Did you actually believe that pathetic story about government auditors and medical liens? You handed over the keys to your entire kingdom because you were too tired and too terrified to read the fine print." She walked slowly across the foyer, her expensive leather heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. She stopped right in front of me, radiating an awful, suffocating arrogance. She reached into her designer handbag, pulled out a crisp, white envelope, and shoved it roughly against my chest. I took the envelope with trembling hands, opening the flap slowly. Inside was a thick piece of premium legal paper, stamped with the same official seal Vance had used 2 days prior. I unfolded it. It was a formal, legally drafted eviction notice. The header boldly proclaimed that Clara was the sole, uncontested legal owner of the property. The cold, mechanical text below demanded that Arthur Thomas Pendleton vacate the premises entirely within 30 days, or face immediate removal by local law enforcement. "Clara owns this house now," Beatrice said, her voice dropping into a malicious, gloating whisper. "She bought it fair and square. The wire transfer cleared this morning. My lawyer is currently drafting the divorce papers, and I am demanding half of whatever pathetic cash reserves you have left hidden in your personal accounts. You have exactly 30 days to pack up your ragged clothes and find a cheap apartment before Clara brings in the demolition crews to gut this entire monstrosity." She stood there, practically panting with excitement, waiting for the emotional explosion. She was waiting for me to fall to my knees. She expected me to scream, to cry, to beg for her forgiveness, to plead with her to stay. She wanted to drink my tears and use my devastation to fuel her own twisted ego. She wanted the dramatic, messy climax of a soap opera where the defeated husband realizes his life is entirely over. I looked down at the eviction notice in my hands. I read the heavy, threatening legal jargon that ordered me out of my own masterpiece. Then, I looked slowly back up at her face. I did not scream. I did not shed a single tear. I simply nodded. I let out a long, shuddering sigh, perfectly mimicking the sound of a man whose entire spirit had just been snapped in half. I looked at the floor, refusing to meet her triumphant gaze, and tightened my grip on my cane. "I understand," I said quietly, my voice barely louder than a whisper. "I understand. Beatrice, I will not fight you. I am too old, and I am far too tired to fight. I will start packing my things tonight." Without waiting for her response, I turned my back to her. I began the long, slow, agonizingly deliberate climb up the grand mahogany staircase. I gripped the banister tightly, pulling myself up one step at a time, keeping my head bowed in total, crushing defeat behind me. The foyer was entirely silent. The movers had paused. Beatrice was standing perfectly still. The absolute lack of resistance was not part of her grand script. She had prepared herself for a brutal, screaming match, a desperate legal threat, or a pathetic emotional breakdown. My quiet, immediate surrender deeply unnerved her. I could feel her eyes burning into my back as I reached the landing. I could sense the sudden, nagging doubt creeping into her mind. Why was I not fighting back? Why was an architect who loved his home more than life itself simply rolling over and handing over the keys? She brushed the feeling away quickly, desperately convincing herself that my age and my failing mind had finally broken my spirit. She convinced herself she was simply a brilliant mastermind who had successfully outsmarted a fading old man. I walked down the long hallway, listening to her shout a new, slightly flustered order at the movers downstairs. I stepped into my quiet study and pushed the heavy oak door firmly shut until I heard the solid, comforting click of the brass latch. The moment I was completely alone, isolated in my fortress. The fragile old man routine vanished instantly. I threw my cane onto the leather sofa. I stood up perfectly straight, rolled my tense shoulders back, and let out a deep, booming laugh that I had been holding in my chest for the last 48 hours. I walked over to my desk and tossed the threatening eviction notice carelessly into the metal trash can by my feet. It was a completely worthless piece of paper, printed on the authority of a completely worthless deed. Clara did not own my home. Clara owned a magnificent illusion, and she had just paid $250,000 to the very woman who was about to lose everything. I sat down in my heavy leather chair, poured myself a small, celebratory glass of expensive bourbon, and turned on my computer. I opened my private email server and began drafting a message to my own aggressive legal team. They had taken the bait. They had executed the fraudulent wire transfer. Beatrice had officially abandoned the marital home, legally cementing her malicious intent. They thought they had just given me 30 days to pack up my entire life and vanish into the night. They had absolutely no idea that I was simply giving them 30 days to spend money they no longer had, digging a financial grave so deep that neither of them would ever be able to climb out. There is a distinct, deeply satisfying flavor to watching your enemies eagerly dig their own graves while you stand quietly by holding the shovel. The true art of a flawless retaliation does not lie in a sudden, violent explosion of anger, but rather in the agonizingly slow, calculated patience required to let the guilty parties destroy themselves entirely on their own terms. For the next 14 days, I became a ghost haunting the very halls I had built. I retreated to the small guest bedroom at the end of the second-floor hallway, leaving the Grand Master Suite completely abandoned. I needed Clara to feel an overwhelming, intoxicating sense of absolute ownership. I needed her to believe the eviction notice she had proudly served me was an unbreakable law of the land, an undeniable mandate that gave her the ultimate power over my domain. She did not waste a single second. The very morning after Beatrice moved out, Clara marched through the heavy oak front doors as if she were a conquering queen claiming her new castle. She brought a small army of loud, arrogant contractors with her. They wore heavy work boots that tracked thick mud across my pristine mahogany floors, loudly discussing tearing down load-bearing walls and ripping out the custom stonework I had painstakingly laid by hand 30 years ago. I sat quietly in my study. The door cracked just enough to hear the absolute circus unfolding downstairs. Clara was standing in the center of the living room, pointing aggressively at the beautiful, hand-carved fireplace mantel. She loudly instructed a contractor to smash it to pieces and replace it with a cheap, modern slate design she had seen in a flashy magazine. She marched out to the back patio, waving her hands wildly, demanding they rip up the magnificent rose garden I had cultivated for decades to make room for a massive, heated infinity pool. The lead contractor, a burly man with a thick clipboard, looked hesitant. He warned her that digging a pool of that magnitude would require a massive, non-refundable deposit up front to secure the specialized excavation equipment and the necessary city permits. Clara just laughed, a high, grating sound that echoed across the property. She bragged loudly about her newfound wealth, proudly pulling out her checkbook and signing a binding contract right there on the hood of his truck. She was eagerly signing her name to heavy, non-refundable financial agreements, completely unaware of the terrifying avalanche she was triggering with every careless stroke of her pen. While Clara was busy destroying the physical integrity of my home, Beatrice was busy destroying what was left of Clara's life savings. My cellular phone became a daily source of vile, mocking entertainment. Beatrice simply could not resist the overwhelming urge to gloat. She was drunk on the illusion of victory and desperately wanted to make sure I was suffering in the shadows. My screen would light up at 2 p.m. with a photograph of a crystal champagne flute resting on the polished railing of a luxury yacht. A few hours later, I would receive a picture of a brand new, fiery red sports car parked outside a high-end designer boutique in the city. The text messages attached to these photos were dripping with pure venom. She told me she was finally living the lavish life she deserved, the exciting life I had supposedly kept her from experiencing by trapping her in a boring marriage. She mocked my age, my supposedly failing memory, and my pathetic surrender to her brilliant intellect. One Tuesday evening, she sent me a screenshot of a digital receipt for a pair of diamond earrings. The total was staggering, $25,000. She added a cruel caption telling me she was wearing them to a private dinner party that evening, and that I should make sure I packed my ugly old sweaters before the eviction deadline officially arrived. I replied with exactly what she desperately wanted to hear. I typed out short, pathetic messages, begging her to reconsider her actions, telling her I was struggling to find a small apartment I could afford on my meager pension. I pleaded with her for just a few more weeks of time. Every single pathetic text I sent only fueled her raging ego, pushing her to spend the stolen money even faster. She felt utterly invincible. She felt absolutely no remorse, only the thrilling, blinding rush of pure, unchecked greed. They both thought I was spending my days weeping into my hands, paralyzed by fear and heartbreak. They had no idea that while Clara was confidently choosing pool tiles and Beatrice was buying expensive diamonds, I was sitting in the sleek, glass-walled conference room of the most ruthless, high-powered corporate law firm in the entire state. My legal team was vastly different from the slimy, fast-talking con artist Vance they had hired. My lead attorney, Mr. Sterling, was a man of terrifying precision. He wore impeccably tailored suits and spoke with a quiet, lethal authority that commanded absolute respect. I handed him a small, encrypted digital drive containing every single piece of evidence I had meticulously gathered over the past month. Sterling sat in absolute silence for nearly an hour, reviewing the downloaded emails, the fraudulent text messages, the bank transfer receipts, and the laughable eviction notice they had served me. When he finally looked up from his reading glasses, his eyes were cold and sharp. He told me he had seen many cases of elder abuse and financial fraud in his long career, but he had never seen perpetrators leave behind such a blindingly clear, undeniable trail of their own sheer stupidity. We built an absolute fortress of a case. We verified the original, irrevocable trust I had established 5 years prior, ensuring every single comma and signature was legally unassailable and fully recognized by the state. We drafted the necessary documents to formally dissolve my marriage to Beatrice, carefully outlining her blatant financial infidelity, her conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and her willful, documented abandonment of the marital home. By leaving voluntarily and attempting to steal my assets, she had permanently forfeited any legal right to claim spousal support or a single penny of my legitimate wealth. The trap was no longer just a defensive legal maneuver. It was about to become a devastating public execution of their entire financial futures. And they were walking toward it completely blind to the heavy blade poised right above their necks. Sterling asked me if I wanted to serve them with the real papers immediately, to stop the contractors from causing any more structural damage to the property. I shook my head slowly. a deep, predatory smile spreading across my face. I told him we needed to wait. A trap is only truly effective if the prey is fully committed, climbing so deep inside the cage that there is absolutely no possibility of a retreat. I needed them to burn through the cash. If I stopped them now, Clara would simply demand her money back from Beatrice, and Beatrice would likely have enough cash reserves left to comply, resulting in a messy but entirely survivable financial loss for both of them. That outcome was completely unacceptable. They had conspired to leave me homeless, destitute, and broken. A simple financial slap on the wrist was not justice. I needed total, uncompromising, and permanent annihilation. I returned to my estate and continued to play the quiet ghost. I watched from the upstairs window as the massive excavation crews arrived, tearing giant, gaping holes into the manicured lawn. I listened to the heavy machinery grind away at the earth, knowing Clara had just authorized a $40,000 wire transfer to keep their shovels moving. I watched Beatrice's social media accounts, which my paralegal team was actively monitoring and saving for the court, as she enthusiastically booked a $50,000 luxury cruise around the Mediterranean, paying for it entirely up front with non-refundable cash. Day by day, dollar by dollar, they were incinerating Clara's life savings. The $250,000 was rapidly vanishing, magically converted into designer handbags, non-refundable contractor deposits, and first-class airline tickets. They were feasting on a poisoned banquet, completely intoxicated by the rich flavor, oblivious to the venom currently shutting down their vital organs. By the end of the second week, the financial damage they had enthusiastically inflicted upon themselves was catastrophic and entirely irreversible. Clara had officially committed over $100,000 to various remodeling companies, signing binding legal contracts that promised massive financial penalties if she ever canceled the work or failed to pay the remaining balances. Beatrice had spent nearly $80,000 on luxury goods, premium spa treatments, and lavish vacations, draining her newly acquired cash reserves at a truly terrifying speed. The 30-day eviction deadline they had proudly given me was exactly 14 days away. They thought the countdown was ticking down on my life in that house, completely oblivious to the fact that their own absolute ruin was already locked in, fully loaded, and ready to fire. I picked up my cellular phone and dialed Sterling's direct number. He answered on the very first ring, his voice calm and steady. I looked out the window at the massive, ugly dirt pile ruining my beautiful backyard. I smiled, feeling a profound, heavy sense of peace settle deep into my bones. I told him it was time. I told him the trap was completely full, the bait was entirely gone, and the heavy iron doors were heavily padlocked from the outside. It was finally time to invite my darling wife and her greedy sister to a very special, highly formal meeting. It was time to show them exactly what happens when you try to steal from a master builder who always prepares for the worst possible structural failures. The trap was finally set, and the only thing left to do was send out the gilded invitations to my own executioners. They thought they were walking into a formal surrender, completely unaware that the very room we were about to sit in was specifically designed to absorb their impending cries of financial agony. Early Tuesday morning, my lead attorney, Mr. Sterling, dispatched a private courier directly to Beatrice's new luxury high-rise apartment downtown. The official summons was drafted with meticulous, terrifying care. It was perfectly designed to stroke their massive egos and completely bypass any lingering suspicion they might have held. It formally requested the immediate presence of both Beatrice and Clara at Sterling's prestigious downtown law firm to execute the final, mandatory handover of the estate. The letter explicitly stated that the meeting was a strict legal necessity to finalize the transfer of the physical house keys, the master alarm system codes, and the remaining local deeds pertaining to the exact property boundaries. It was a completely fabricated legal necessity, a beautiful piece of fiction, but to two women hopelessly drunk on their own greed, it sounded like the glorious final coronation ceremony of their grand victory. I arrived at the law firm an hour early to center myself. Sterling's offices occupied the entire 40th floor of a massive, imposing glass skyscraper right in the financial district. The main conference room was an intimidating display of raw corporate power, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sweeping city skyline, heavy mahogany-paneled walls, and a massive granite table that felt as cold and unyielding as the justice I was about to serve. I took my seat at the head of the table. I did not bring my wooden cane. I did not slouch my shoulders or practice my trembling hands. I wore a perfectly tailored, dark charcoal suit I had purchased for my retirement party 10 years ago. A suit that commanded respect and projected absolute authority. I wanted them to see exactly who they were truly dealing with the very second they walked through those doors, right before I dropped the massive anvil on their heads. Promptly at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the heavy double doors of the conference room swung open. Beatrice and Clara marched inside, bringing with them an overwhelming wave of expensive, cloying perfume and blinding, repulsive arrogance. They looked like they had just walked off the set of a terrible, low-budget reality television show. Beatrice was draped in a massive, fluffy fur coat that she absolutely refused to take off. Despite the perfectly climate-controlled air of the executive office, she carried a brand-new designer handbag that likely cost more than a reliable used car. Clara wore a tight, bright red dress and massive, ridiculous sunglasses, clutching her own expensive purse tightly against her side. She immediately looked around the room, taking in the expensive artwork on the walls and the sweeping views of the city, likely already calculating exactly how much more money she could squeeze out of the local boundary deeds she foolishly thought were waiting for her on the granite table. Neither of them brought their slippery, fast-talking lawyer, Mr. Vance. That was the first absolute sign of their towering, fatal hubris. They genuinely believed I was so thoroughly defeated, so broken and legally inept, that they did not even need legal representation to collect the final, bleeding scraps of my dignity. They were walking into a lion's den entirely unarmed, wearing coats made of fresh meat. Beatrice saw me sitting calmly at the head of the table and immediately let out a loud, mocking scoff. She threw her designer handbag onto the polished granite with a loud, disrespectful thud. She leaned over the table, placing her hands flat against the cold stone, and glared at me with pure, unfiltered malice. "I certainly hope you brought the physical keys. Arthur?" she snapped, her voice sharp and incredibly impatient. "Clara's demolition contractors are waiting to rip out those hideous, outdated oak floors tomorrow morning, and we absolutely do not have the time to play any more of your sad little games today. Have you found a cheap apartment yet, or are you actually planning to sleep in the back seat of your old car?" I did not say a single word. I simply looked at her, my face completely devoid of any emotion. I kept my breathing slow and steady. My absolute silence infuriated her. She wanted me to cry. She wanted me to beg for a few more days to pack or ask her for a small, pathetic loan to cover my security deposit. When I gave her nothing but a cold, empty stare, she lost what little composure she had left. For 10 agonizing minutes, she paced the length of the massive conference room, launching into a venomous, entirely unhinged rant. She listed every single grievance she had ever held against me over our 35-year marriage. She told me I was a boring, rigid old man who cared more about planting stupid trees and sanding wood than I did about showing her the world. She mocked my conservative financial planning, calling me a pathetic hoarder who fully deserved to lose everything he had ever built. Clara eagerly chimed in, practically vibrating with nasty, vindictive delight. She told me the house never suited me anyway, and that it was finally going to be transformed into a vibrant property fit for actual high society. She proudly announced the exact, exorbitant costs of the Italian marble she had already ordered for the bathrooms, bragging loudly about the $50,000 non-refundable deposit she had wired to the overseas importers just 2 days prior. She described the exact shade of bright teal she was painting my beloved, quiet study. She detailed how she was personally throwing all my customized architectural drafting tables into a rented commercial dumpster by the end of the week. They fed violently off each other's toxic energy, their shrill voices echoing off the thick glass walls, creating a chaotic symphony of greed and delusion. I sat perfectly still, letting every single vile word wash over me like water off a stone. I analyzed her posture, the frantic waving of her hands, the sheer, pathetic desperation to validate her own thievery. She was trying to convince herself just as much as she was trying to break me. I wanted them to completely exhaust themselves. I wanted them to build their towering monument of cruelty as high as it could possibly go, ensuring the impending fall would shatter every single illusion they held about their own brilliance. When Beatrice finally ran out of breath, her face flushed red with exertion. She slammed her hand against the granite table one last time. She loudly demanded that I hand over the keys and the remaining deeds immediately so they could leave this depressing room and go to their celebratory champagne brunch across the street. The massive room fell completely, terrifyingly silent. The only sound was the faint, muffled hum of the city traffic 40 floors below us. I slowly uncrossed my legs and sat forward in my heavy leather chair. I looked at Beatrice, then shifted my gaze to Clara, locking eyes with the two women who had happily conspired to leave me to die in poverty. The fragile, terrified old man they had been ruthlessly bullying for the past month was completely gone. In his place sat a master architect who had just finished checking the final structural stress points on a perfectly engineered demolition. I turned my head slightly to my right and gave a single, slow nod to Mr. Sterling. Sterling, who had been standing silently by the window like an invisible shadow, stepped forward. He did not say a word. He did not offer a polite greeting. He simply reached into his slim leather briefcase, pulled out a single, heavy red folder secured with a thick elastic band, and slid it smoothly across the massive granite table. The folder stopped exactly halfway between Beatrice and Clara. Its bright red cover seemed to glow ominously under the harsh fluorescent lights of the conference room, demanding their attention. "What on earth is this?" Beatrice spat, looking at the folder as if it were a highly venomous snake. "I am not signing any more of your pathetic, paranoid paperwork. Arthur, give me the damn keys right now." Sterling adjusted his tailored suit jacket, his face a perfect mask of absolute professional detachment. He looked down at the two women with the kind of cold, clinical pity one reserves for insects hopelessly caught in a web. "That, ladies," Sterling said, his voice deep, booming, and commanding absolute authority, "is the true, legally binding deed to the property you currently believe you own. I highly suggest you open it. A single piece of thick legal paper can weigh more than a concrete block when it holds the power to crush your entire existence." The tension in the heavily air-conditioned room thickened into something you could almost choke on as Clara's perfectly manicured fingers reached for the bright red folder. The only question left to answer was which sister would draw blood first when the absolute reality of their immediate bankruptcy finally set in. Clara flipped open the heavy cardstock cover. She stared at the densely packed legal text, her eyes darting frantically across the page, desperately searching for the familiar, comforting terms of her imaginary ownership. She found absolutely none of them. Mr. Sterling did not give her the opportunity to ask questions. He leaned forward, resting his hands firmly on the polished granite table, and began to read aloud with a voice that sounded like a heavy iron vault slamming shut. "This document," Sterling pronounced, articulating every single syllable with devastating clarity, "is the legally binding declaration of an irrevocable trust, executed 5 full years prior to this afternoon. The sole property held within this trust is the 5-acre estate, the primary residence, and all associated physical fixtures located at the address you currently believe you own. The sole designated trustee and lifetime beneficiary is my client, Mr. Arthur Thomas Pendleton." Clara blinked rapidly, the massive designer sunglasses slipping slightly down her nose. The bright, arrogant flush in her cheeks began to drain away, replaced by a sickly, pale gray. She looked at Beatrice, then back at Sterling, completely unable to process the dense legal reality crashing down on her head. "What does that mean?" Clara demanded, her voice losing its shrill confidence, dropping into a harsh, panicked whisper. I have the deed. Beatrice and I brought the lawyer to the house. Arthur signed the transfer papers right in front of me. I paid for that house. I sat back in my heavy leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest, and finally allowed a cold, merciless smile to touch my lips. The fragile, terrified old man was entirely dead. The master architect had officially taken the floor. You see, Clara, I began, my voice perfectly steady and vibrating with absolute authority. You cannot legally purchase a property from a man who does not legally own it. In the eyes of the state and the federal government, I do not own my home. The trust owns it, because the trust is irrevocable. I have absolutely no legal power to sell, transfer, or gift the property to anyone. Therefore, the incredibly dense, heavily notarized stack of papers you forced me to sign 2 weeks ago is completely and utterly worthless. Beatrice's jaw dropped. The heavy fur coat she had proudly worn into the room suddenly looked like it was suffocating her. She gripped the edge of the granite table so hard her knuckles turned entirely white. "That is impossible," Beatrice gasped, her eyes wide with a sudden, blinding terror. "The wire transfer cleared." The county clerk accepted the paperwork. The county clerk accepts any properly formatted paperwork until a title search disputes it, Sterling interjected smoothly, sliding another crisp sheet of paper across the table. "Which we formally filed yesterday morning. The fraudulent deed has been entirely voided by a federal judge. Which brings us to the financial reality of your current situation?" I leaned forward, locking my eyes directly onto Clara's terrified face. I wanted to make sure she understood every single mathematical calculation of her own destruction. "Clara, you wired $250,000 of your own life savings to your sister," I said, speaking slowly and deliberately. "You thought you were buying my multi-million-dollar estate for pennies on the dollar. In reality, you simply handed Beatrice a massive, untaxed cash gift. You gave her everything you had for absolutely nothing in return." Clara let out a short, high-pitched gasp, clutching her chest as if she had just been physically struck. She slowly turned her head to look at her sister. "And Beatrice," I continued, turning my merciless gaze toward the woman who had happily tried to leave me to die in poverty. "You firmly believed you had outsmarted a tired old man. You thought that money was your grand ticket to a luxurious new life? But you have spent the last 2 weeks eagerly burning through cash that you now desperately owe back to your sister." I pulled a small, folded piece of paper from my inner suit pocket. It was a highly detailed, itemized list provided by my private investigators. I read it aloud, letting the staggering numbers hang heavily in the silent room. $50,000 wired to an overseas importer for custom Italian marble that is currently sitting on a shipping container. $40,000 signed away in non-refundable excavation deposits for a swimming pool that will never be built. $25,000 for a pair of diamond earrings. $50,000 paid up front in cash for a luxury Mediterranean cruise. Not to mention the designer handbags, the luxury car lease, and the exorbitant retainer you undoubtedly paid your fraudulent lawyer. Beatrice was shaking violently. The color had completely vanished from her painted face. She looked like a ghost who had just realized she was entirely trapped in hell. "It is all gone," I stated coldly, dropping the paper onto the table. "You spent Clara's entire life savings in exactly 14 days. You have absolutely no liquid assets left to repay her. Clara is completely broke, and Beatrice, you are massively in debt." "But my alimony," Beatrice practically shrieked, sheer panic finally shattering her arrogant facade. "I am legally entitled to half of your remaining savings. I am your wife. You cannot leave me with nothing." Sterling did not even blink. He smoothly produced a third and final document, pushing it directly toward Beatrice's trembling hands. "Actually, Mrs. Pendleton, he can," Sterling said, his voice dripping with pure legal finality. "By actively conspiring to commit documented wire fraud, by deliberately hiding a massive sum of money in a secret private account, and by voluntarily abandoning the marital home while issuing a fraudulent eviction notice. You have permanently and entirely forfeited any right to claim spousal support. We filed the divorce proceedings this morning under grounds of extreme financial infidelity and malicious abandonment. You get absolutely nothing from the trust, and you get absolutely nothing from my client's personal wealth. The silence that followed was not the quiet of a peaceful room. It was the terrifying, breathless silence right before a massive explosive detonates. Clara stood up slowly. Her bright red dress suddenly looked entirely absurd. She slowly took off her massive sunglasses, revealing eyes that were completely bloodshot and wide with a murderous, unhinged rage. She looked at Beatrice, her own flesh and blood, the woman who had promised her an empire and delivered absolute bankruptcy. "You spent my money," Clara whispered, her voice trembling with a violent, animalistic fury. "You stupid, arrogant fool! You spent every single dime I had left. It was your brilliant idea to buy the house!" Beatrice screamed back, leaping out of her chair, her heavy fur coat slipping off her shoulders and crashing to the floor. "You brought the fraudulent lawyer. You told me the old fool would not notice. I gave you $250,000. Clara roared, completely abandoning any remaining shred of human dignity. She lunged across the granite table, her manicured hands grasping wildly at Beatrice's expensive cream-colored blouse. "Give it back to me. Give me my money right now." The grand, expensive conference room instantly transformed into a chaotic, vicious war zone. Generational resentment and blinding financial panic exploded all at once. Beatrice shrieked in terror as Clara grabbed a handful of her hair, ripping the heavy gold necklace right off her throat. The heavy designer handbag Beatrice had proudly flaunted earlier was knocked off the table, spilling expensive cosmetics and useless luxury receipts all over the polished floor. They screamed, they clawed, and they tore at each other like starving wolves fighting over a completely empty bone. I stood up slowly, calmly buttoning the front of my tailored suit jacket. I looked at the two women rolling on the floor, destroying each other's expensive clothes, completely consumed by the absolute ruin they had eagerly designed for me. I turned to Mr. Sterling, who was watching the violent spectacle with a look of mild, clinical disgust. "Mr. Sterling," I said quietly, my voice perfectly calm over the sound of their chaotic screaming. "I believe our business here is entirely concluded. Please have the building security escort these two vagrants out onto the street. They are ruining the ambiance." Sterling gave a short, respectful nod. I turned my back on the wreckage of my former marriage and walked smoothly out of the heavy double doors. I did not look back. I walked to the elevator, rode it down 40 floors in complete, blissful silence, and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. By the time I drove my car back up the long, winding driveway of my estate, the sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the massive oak trees. Mr. Sterling had personally called the excavation company that morning, threatening them with a massive federal lawsuit, and they had promptly packed up their heavy machinery and fled the property. The dirt piles would take a few weeks to reseed, but the structural integrity of my sanctuary was completely secure. I walked inside my quiet, empty home. The heavy, suffocating weight of Beatrice's toxic presence was entirely gone, replaced by the profound, settling peace of absolute victory. I walked straight into my study, poured myself a generous glass of 50-year-old bourbon, and carried it out to the back patio. I sat down in my favorite wooden chair, resting my feet on the railing. I took a slow, deep sip of the amber liquid, feeling the warm burn settle comfortably in my chest. I watched the wind rustle through the leaves of the trees I had planted with my own two hands. I had successfully cut out the rot, fortified my foundation, and left the termites to eat each other alive in the cold, unforgiving city. My legacy was completely safe, and I was finally, truly home. Thank you so much for watching all the way to the end. I hope Arthur's brilliant, calculated retaliation brought you as much satisfaction as it brought me. If you loved watching these greedy relatives get exactly what they deserved, please take a second to hit that subscribe button, like the video, and share it with someone who appreciates a flawless revenge story. I want to hear from you down in the comments. Drop the word karma to let me know you made it to the very end of the video. And do not forget to hit the hype button so YouTube knows to push this story out to more viewers just like you. I will see you in the next one.